The best 3D character animation starts with an appealing model. This class will teach you the essential 3D modelling skills required to bring simple character designs to life in 3D. Hello, my name is John Knowles. I'm a character animator and animation director, and I've been lucky enough to work in children's television for the last 15 years. In this second class of my Into the Ocean series, we're going to be exploring character modelling for animation. This is a standalone class, and you're free to follow along using the provided design. However, if you've already taken my character design class, you may wish to use one of your own designs instead. Character modelling for animation can be time consuming and take many years to master. However, if you start out with simple characters, then you can learn all of the essential skills that you need, which will provide a foundation for all of your future projects. During this class, I will share my approach to not only modelling, but also texturing, shading and lighting a character. We will also then go on to place this character into a simple underwater environment. This is a beginner level class using the free 3D software application Blender. Now if you're new to Blender, you may want to check out my Blender Essentials class, which will teach you everything you need to know to get started. By the end of this class, you'll have all of the skills necessary to model simple characters of your own. And you'll also be ready to move forward to the next class in the series, where you'll learn how to add controls in the form of a character rig, and finally, fully animate your character. So, if you're ready to dive into the world of character modelling for animation, let's get started. Hello and welcome to the class. In this class, you'll be able to follow along as I demonstrate how to model, texture, light and render this tropical fish character. You can download my concept art from the class project page, or feel free to follow along using one of your own character designs. There are several different approaches to character modelling, but when it comes to getting started, one of the easiest is known as box modelling. In this approach, we literally start out with a 3D cube, and by subdividing it and moving around the vertices, the points on the surface, we'll gradually form the shape of our character. Once our model is complete, we'll then move on into texture painting. For this section of the class, I'd highly recommend having access to some form of graphics tablet or pen display with a pressure sensitive stylus. Whilst this is not essential, it will make the texture painting process both easier and more enjoyable. Once our textures are complete, we'll create a simple environment and set up the lighting required to create a believable underwater image. For your class project, I'd love to see either your version of my character design or how you've applied the demonstrated principles to modelling one of your own original character designs. Once you're finished, just upload a rendered image of your final project to the class project gallery for feedback and to share with the other students. If you'd like feedback along the way, feel free to upload work in progress images too, or ask questions on the class discussions page. Now, if you're ready to get started, let's jump into the first lesson. Before we start to model anything in Blender, it's worth thinking about the scale that we're going to be working at. Now with the default scene and my cube selected, if I hit the N key, I can open up this side panel. And that shows me the dimensions of my cube are currently 2 meters in size. I know that the fish that we're planning to model is about 20 centimeters long. So I can adjust that value to 0.2 meters, 20 centimeters. And obviously I could go ahead, zoom in on that cube and start working on it and model the fish. The problem comes when we then want to add our lighting to our scene. In Blender, if we work with very small objects, you'll find that we actually have to adjust far more parameters in order to get the lighting to look convincing. That's because by default, Blender is set up to work with larger objects. Now there are two ways to approach this. Obviously we can go ahead, model our object at the correct scale, in this case 20 centimeters, and adjust all of our parameters to work. Alternatively, we can actually adjust the internal scale system that Blender works with. To do that, if you head over to the Properties panel, you can see the Scene Properties. If we click on that tab, that will give us a Unit section. And if you roll that out, you can see that we can change a number of values here. To start with, because we're going to be working in centimeters, let's change our length from meters to centimeters. You can see now that this is updated up here in the Transform Properties. But in addition, we have this unit scale option. The moment that is set to 1. What I'm going to do here is change this value. I'm going to divide it by 10. So we now have a unit scale of 0.1. You'll see our grid has changed and the dimensions of our cube now show as 2 centimeters. If I hit Alt S on the keyboard, that will reset my scale. So now my cube is the same as its default size, but you'll see the dimensions are shown as 20 centimeters. By working this way, now all of our light parameters can be used at their default values, and we'll get a far better result without as much tweaking. Now it's worth keeping in mind, if you intend to model multiple objects or characters and then bring them together into one scene, you do need to work at the same unit scale across all of those objects. For example, if I were to model this fish with a unit scale of 0.1, because that's the easiest way of working, and then go ahead and start to model a shark, I might decide that a unit scale of 1 was more appropriate for that shark, since it's a larger creature. Unfortunately, if I then brought this fish that we're modeling now into the scene with the shark, it would be multiplied in size by a factor of 10. Now it's possible to then scale that fish down to the correct size. Simply scaling it by a factor of 10 will bring it into line with the shark that's been modelled in a scene with a unit scale of 1. It's just something that you need to be aware of. As a rule of thumb, what I'd recommend is that you use a unit scale which will work for the largest objects in your scene. In this case, we know that our fish is going to be the only object in our scene, so we can work with a unit scale of 0.1 quite happily. As I say, if I was going to combine this fish with a larger creature, such as a shark or a whale, I'd work with a larger unit scale and just model this fish smaller, because I know my lighting is going to work for the larger scale in the other scene. The other thing to be aware of when you're adjusting your scale is that the unit scale value is specific to our individual scene file. If we were to create a new scene file, it would reset to 1. So always check that value before you start modeling something new. Now that we have our units set up correctly, I'm just going to save my file. So hit Ctrl S, pick a location on your hard drive that you're happy to save your file, and give it a name. And then click Save. We're now ready to start loading our reference in the next lesson. When you're planning to model something, you can go ahead and do it freeform within Blender, but it's actually really helpful to have reference to work from. It makes the whole modeling process a lot quicker and easier. I've created some concept art for this lesson which you can download from the project resources section. Alternatively, feel free to create something of your own. Before we load it in, what we're going to do is switch to the side view in Blender. You can do that simply by hitting the number 3 on your numpad. Alternatively, if you don't have a numpad, you can always use this gizmo at the top here to navigate to the different views. So what I'm going to do now is open up a file browser, and I'm just going to drag and drop my reference file straight into Blender. And what we can do, because this has been dropped slightly away from the origin, is just hit Alt-G, and that will reset its position back to the center here. Select my cube and hit the period key on the numpad to frame everything up. Now, we want to move this reference into roughly the right place for us to work with. So to help with that, I'm just going to change into X-ray mode. And we can do that with this little icon up at the top here. Alternatively, you can use the shortcut Alt-Z. We can now see through our cube. So now, if I select my reference object, which you can see up in the outliner here is called empty at the moment. First, I'm going to rename that. So I'm going to hit F2 and rename that to reference. And then I'm just going to hit G, and with the middle mouse, constrain it to the y-axis and shift it along just until the fish is roughly centered up with my axis. The next thing I'd like to do is duplicate this reference so that we can have a reference for the front of the fish that we're going to see from the front view. So with my reference selected, I can just hit Shift D to duplicate it. I'm going to right click, and that will just leave it back where it was. But you can see we've got a new reference up here in the outliner. If I now switch my view with my numpad by hitting number 1, I'll move around to the front view. I can now rotate this reference by hitting R to rotate, Z to constrain it to the Z axis, and then 90 will rotate it around. Hit Enter to confirm. And then again with the G key, I'm just going to drag that across till it's roughly centered up on those axes. Now if I move around my viewport, you can see these two references are right over the top of each other. So the other thing that I'm going to do, so I'm going to move these back away from each other. So I'm just going to hit G, I'm going to constrain this in Y and just move this out of the way a little bit. and do the same here with this reference. Move that along the x-axis till it's out of the way of my cube, so I can move around and see my references there if I choose to. But again, if I hit the 1 key or the 3 key on my numpad, you can see I can move to the different views. Now, it looks like I've moved this in the wrong direction, so I'm just going to come back here and move it again along the x-axis back to the other side of the cube, which will make it easier. If we jump into our side view, we can see the cube on top of that reference. Now, with our 2 references created, what I'm actually going to do is select the 2 of them in the outliner, hit the M key to create a new collection, and then we'll name that collection reference. This allows us to quickly turn those references on and off together. The other thing that we can do is change our filters for our outliner, and I'm going to turn on the selectability filter. So you can see we now have this little arrow check mark here. So if I turn that off for the reference collection, you'll see that I'm now no longer able to select those reference objects. I can only select my actual cube. I can now hit Alt-Z to turn off my X-ray view, and we'll be ready to start modelling in the next lesson. So far we've been working in the layout view, and we can continue staying in the layout view as we start to model. But we also have the modelling workspace which we can switch over to. That will give us just a little bit more room to work with. The other thing you'll notice as we've jumped into the modelling view is that it's automatically switched us into edit mode. We can toggle that back and forth still using the tab key if we choose to. So for now I'm going to start out by hitting the 3 on my numpad to jump into the side view, and I'm going to frame everything up. I'm also going to hit Alt-Z to enable X-ray mode so I can see through the mesh. And we're going to start out by mapping out the main shape of this fish. Now, something that's really important to understand is that at the moment we've only got a few points on this mesh that we can move around. So we don't have enough detail to model this fish. And you might think that we need to add in a lot of extra detail. And we could do that by selecting all of the points, right-clicking, hitting subdivide, and we can keep doing that to add in more and more detail. And then we could start moving these points around to define the shape of our fish. But you'll quickly find if you start to move all of these points around individually, it's going to take a very long time to form the shape of our fish. It's not a very efficient way of working. And you'll also find it very difficult to end up with a smooth result. So instead, what we're going to do is keep things as simple as possible to start with. So with our cube, we will hit A to select all of the vertices, then hit right click to subdivide. So we're going to start out keeping things very simple with just the one subdivision. What I'm now going to do is start moving some of these points into place. Now you do need to be in X-ray mode in order to select through this mesh. At the moment you can see as I drag select across that point, I've actually selected right the way through the mesh. If, for example, I had X-ray mode turned off and I tried to select this point, see as I rotate around the mesh, I've only selected that one point. So I'm going to turn X-ray mode back on and start moving some of these points around. The first thing I'm going to do is actually select all of these points, and I'm just going to move them across slightly. What I'm looking for are main markers where the shape of the fish changes direction. So I'm moving these points so that they're roughly at the top of the fish here, and these points are roughly at the low point of the fish down at the bottom here. I'll just move these points somewhere in between the two. I'm then going to select these points and just shift them across so that they're roughly in front of the mouth here. And drag that up and these points down. For now, we're not worried about perfectly maintaining this shape. We're just trying to move things broadly into the right place. So at the back here, I'm looking at the point where the fins start, and that's where I'm going to move these points into place. Now, I'm going to rotate around. What you'll notice is as I'm moving around the mesh here, this reference is actually getting in the way a little bit. It's not really all that helpful when we're not in one of the orthographic views, either the side view or the front view. So first of all, if we hit Tab to change back into object mode, we can now select our reference object in the outliner. And then if we go down to the object data properties, you'll see that we have the image here. And up above, we have some attributes which define how this image is applied. At the moment, we have these check marks to show that it's visible in both the orthographic and perspective views. I can uncheck the perspective view, and I'm going to do that on my reference 1 object as well. Now that that's been unchecked, I can't see the objects in my perspective view. But if I hit either the 1 or the 3 keys, I can once again see my reference. So that's really handy to work on the reference this way and then move around the mesh and not have the reference getting in the way. So I'm going to select my cube again. I'm going to hit Tab to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to hit A to select all of the points. Now what I want to do is scale all of these in along the x-axis. So I can just hit S and X to constrain along the x-axis and drag them in. Now I'm going to switch over to the front view so that we can see how that's looking. For now, I'm not going to worry too much about the exact shape. I'm just going to scale them in a little bit further on X to about here. So I'm looking at this point here on the top of the head where we get a little bit of a change in direction. And we'll flesh this out a little bit further later on. Now, if I rotate around this again in perspective view, what I want to do is select some of these faces and extrude them out. So to do that, I'm going to change into face select mode. So I just hit the number 3 on the keyboard. And I can now shift select each of these front faces. Now, if I hit the E key, that will extrude those faces and I can bring them out a little bit. Just going to drop them there for now and jump back into my side view. So we brought them out a bit at the back here. I'm just going to bring them a little bit further and drop them somewhere around the root of the tail here. I'm going to hit 1 to jump back into vertex select, and I'm going to start pulling these other vertices into place. So again, just hit the G key to move these down roughly into position. And you can see here, I'm not following the shape of the fins at the moment. I'm only interested in the actual shape of the main part of the body. And I'm actually going to bring them down to the root of that tail. And I'm going to keep these points roughly in the center. We can now rotate it around, and I'm going to select these front faces and again hit E to extrude them out a bit. In this case, what I'm going to do is drop them again at this break point here. I'm going to hit the 1 key so I can select my vertices again and move these into place. Now I'm going to move these vertices here so I'm roughly following the shape of this mouth, and you'll see why in a little while. Again, I want to select those front faces, just using 3 for face select, then jump back to the side. I can hit E and extrude them out to the end of the nose. Again, we'll go back in to vertex select and start moving these points roughly into place. Now the other thing we need to do is have a look at this tail. So same routine applies. Select all of those faces at the back there. Come back to the side and E to extrude. I'm just going to pull them back to the end of the tail. And then move the vertices roughly into place. We'll add some extra detail to all of this in a little while. Now hopefully you can see as we rotate around, I'm going to turn off X-ray. We've got the main shape of our fish in, and then we can start to create the right volume and then break it down even further. But before we do that, I'm just going to hit Ctrl S to save. Now that we have our main shape defined, we can start to add in a bit more detail. But before we go too far into that, I want to actually adjust the volume of our fish a little bit so it's better following the outer contours. The more that we do that with a lower resolution mesh, the easier it's going to be to create the final shape as we add in extra detail. So to do that, I'm going to hit Alt-Z to go back into X-ray mode. I'm going to start out with this tail. So I'm just going to select through and select all of the vertices for that tail. And now I'm going to hit S to scale and X to scale them in on the X-axis. I'm going to get that fairly narrow. I can do the same at the front of the fish. And now I'm going to want this to have a bit of a taper to it. So again, SX and bring that in a little bit. I'm going to leave everything up at the top here, but I'm going to select these central points because we're going to want to make things a little bit wider. So I'm going to hit the 1 key to go to this front view, and again S and X to scale these points, and I'm going to move them out to start defining the overall shape of the fish. You can see also that we need to taper things a little bit more on the bottom. So I'm going to select through again all of those points and scale them in on the X-axis. Now as we orbit around, you can see we're getting a better overall shape. These 2 points here will need scaling out a little bit, just so that we're getting a better flow of the shape around here. Now we'll further define the shape as we go along. What I might do is just taper those 2 at the back. Just bring them in a little. Maybe a bit more, so that we're getting a little bit of a fall off as we drop back. I'll do the same up at the top here. Just scale those in a bit. A little bit down at the bottom. There we go. We can now start to add in some of the extra detail. So for that, I'm going to hit 3 on my numpad. I'm going to start to better define the shape of the fish. To do that, we're going to add in some edge loops. And you can do that by hitting Ctrl R. As you move your mouse pointer around, you can see this yellow line is indicating where you're going to be adding a loop. So I'll start out just by adding one in right here. Once you click, you'll be able to slide this edge loop around, or you can just hit the right mouse button to drop it right in the center, which is what I'm going to do. Now I'm just going to select through the mesh again and move these points up to better define this overall shape. Again, down at the bottom here. I'll add in another edge loop here, Ctrl R, and again hit the right mouse button to cancel the move, and just move them into place as I choose. At the back here, I think I'm going to add in 2 loops along this section. So when you hit Ctrl R, by default, it's going to add in a single loop. But while you've got this yellow line up here, if you scroll your mouse wheel, you'll be able to change the number of loops that you're going to add in. So I'm going to add in 2 loops there, and again, right click to cancel the move, and then move our points into place. Then I'm also going to subdivide this tail a little bit further. And in the case of the tail, we know we're going to want that to bend as we're animating it. So what we need to do is add in enough geometry to allow this to bend successfully. So what I'm actually going to do is add in a couple of loops and then hit the right mouse button again to cancel that. Then I'm just going to again adjust their position slightly to shape the tail, give it a little bit of a curved form to it so nothing's too even. And you'll see again as we orbit around, we're starting to get a more defined shape to our fish here. We obviously need to add some more detail down the sides here, but the overall shape is looking a lot better. Before we start to add in any more edge loops, what I'd like to do is add what's called a subdivision surface modifier. We'll do that in the next lesson. So far we've been adding edge loops to better define our geometry. But if I just jump out of X-ray mode for a minute, you can see that our fish still looks quite blocky. And we could keep adding in extra loops over and over. But the more geometry we add into our mesh, the heavier our seam becomes and the more complicated it is to deform the mesh ultimately. Therefore, what we can do is work with what's called a subdivision surface modifier. To do that, I'm just going to hit Tab to exit out of edit mode. And then we can move over to the modifiers tab in the property panel. You can see here under the modifiers, if we hit add modifier, we can move down to subdivision surface. If I click on that, you can see automatically our mesh has increased in complexity. Now we've got two values here, our viewport level and our render level. If I increase this viewport level up to 2, you'll see again our mesh has been further subdivided. But if I hit the tab key, you'll see that we still have our original mesh here. It's just been subdivided within that. But if I were to select points on this mesh and move them around, you can see it's moving all of those other points with it. And at any point, I can go back and I can adjust this viewport level right the way down, and we're back to our original mesh. So this is a far easier way of working with a high-res mesh. We have this lower-res mesh that we actually manipulate, and then we can increase the detail, and certainly at render time, increase that detail potentially even further to get a smooth result. The other thing you'll notice is at the moment our mesh is very faceted. If I jump back into object mode, I can just right click and hit shade smooth, and that will smooth everything out for us. Now if I hit the 3 key to jump back into the side view, you can see that particularly if I turn on X-ray mode, our smooth mesh doesn't quite exactly follow our concept art. So to modify that, if we hit the tab key, we can actually select these vertices and start moving them a little bit above our concept art so that we're actually creating a smooth shape that better follows the design. So I'm just going to take a minute here and adjust some of these points until it's following a little bit more closely. As we add in extra geometry, we'll probably need to adjust this yet further. And that should do us for now. Don't forget to save. The next thing I'd like to do is add in a bit of extra geometry to define the shape of the side of the character. So to do that, again, I'm going to use the edge loop tool. So I'm going to hit Ctrl R. Again, using my mouse scroll wheel, I'm going to add in 2 edge loops here, and right click to confirm. I'm then going to do the same at the bottom here. Ctrl R, scroll up, and add in 2 edge loops at the bottom. Now you notice we now have roughly square faces throughout this mesh. And that's really useful when it comes to both texturing and deforming the character. If you end up with shapes that are too deformed from basic square shape, you can end up with some stretching within the mesh or within the textures that can be undesirable. So wherever possible, work with roughly square shapes. Now, throughout the body you can see our geometry is fairly even, but we've actually got a bit more geometry down at the front here than I really want. So what I'd like to do is get rid of some of this, but still keep the extra detail at the back here where we need it. So to do that, what I'm going to do is start merging some of these points together. Now before we start doing all of that, what we're going to do is actually split this mesh in half. And I'll show you why in just a minute. So if you hit the 1 key on your numpad, what we want to do is actually select half of this mesh. And what I'm going to do is drag select over all the vertices just to the left side of this mesh here. Making sure that I've got everything on the left side but nothing in the middle here. And then I'm going to hit X and delete vertices. Now, it's worth actually checking out that you've not accidentally deleted anything that you shouldn't have. That looks like I've got half of the fish as I would like. I'm now just going to jump back into object mode by hitting the tab key. And then if we go over into our modifiers panel, we can add what's called a mirror modifier, which we do just here. If we do that, you can see it's added the other side of the fish back in again. That's because it's reflected across the x-axis here. If for any reason your mirror is not working correctly, it may be that your axes are set up incorrectly. So it's doing something like this or this. So just adjust that until you've got the correct axis selected. Now if we hit the tab key, you can see that by working on just one half of this mesh, if I move the points around, anything I do is mirrored over to the other side. So now that we've done that, as I said, I want to reduce some of the geometry in here. And what we can do is we can select some of these vertices, and I need to select them in the correct order. So I'm going to select that first one, the second vertice, and then the third one. And I'm going to collapse all of these down into that single vertice at the bottom. So you can see that final one is selected, it's in white. Now if I hit M, that will allow us to merge. And we have a number of different options here, but if I choose at last, I know that that will merge down into that final vertice that we selected. If I click that, you can see all of those vertices have collapsed down and we've kept the location of that bottom vertice. I'm going to do the same just here. Again, selecting an order, hit M, at last, and that's collapsed that down. And I'm going to do the same thing just here as well. M, at last, and that's collapsed that down. Now, you'll see that we've reduced the amount of geometry at the front here, so we've evened that out a little bit. But at the moment, you can see that we've introduced this star point here, which has a lot of different edges radiating out from it. And we actually have two faces here, which are triangles, rather than the quad shapes that we've got throughout the rest of the mesh. Now, because these two are triangles, what we can actually do is go into edge mode and just select this one edge down the middle. I'm going to right click and then I can choose dissolve edges. That will remove that edge but leave me with one face which actually has four sides. And if I just go back into vertex select, I can grab that one point and just move it back a bit, and you'll see that we actually have a quad shape here. By doing this, we're creating a flow of faces that comes around the bottom and comes up and over the top of the nose there. And then we have these separate faces on the front here. And this is something that you want to think about generally as you're creating your mesh. You can see here that I shaped these points here to follow the shape of the mouth. If I jump over here, you'll see that a little bit better. And the reason is we're actually going to create extra geometry in here to define the shape of that mouth in more detail as we go on. If we weren't paying any heed to the shape of these underlying features, then it'd be very difficult to add in that extra geometry. Now that we've reduced the geometry in here, I actually want to add in one final edge loop around the nose here. I'm just going to hit Ctrl R to add that in, click to confirm, and right click to stop that sliding. That just gives us a bit of extra geometry to help shape this nose a little bit better. I'm going to pull these points forwards, and these ones under the mouth I'm just going to drop down a little bit further, because as I say, I'm going to add in some extra geometry here in a little while. I'll pull that back a bit to help define that shape a little bit better. There we are. Now that we have all of this extra geometry in place, it's worth taking a look from the front and seeing how things look. Because at the moment we haven't adjusted the volume at all from the side. So we're going to want to push some of these points out. And it's slightly easier to do that by looking at the perspective view here. And you can see we've got quite a flat side to it here. What we can actually do is holding down the Alt key and clicking on one of these edges will select the entire edge loop. With that done, we can actually scale these out from the center. So what I want to do is actually just check up at the top here, my transform pivot point. If I change that to be the 3D cursor, which is right in the center of the 3 axes there, then I'll be scaling out from that 3D cursor. So if I now hit S to scale and X, that will actually allow me to scale these points out away from that center point and better define the outside edge to the fish. One thing that I should note here before we start moving things around too much is if I select one of these points along the top here and hit G to move, I can actually break this mesh apart. So if I just right click to cancel that move, if we go over and have a look at this mirror modifier, we have an option here called clipping. If I enable that and now try to move that same point by hitting G, you'll see it stays stuck to the center. That means we can't ever introduce a break into the mesh there. So I'm just going to hit right mouse button to cancel that move, but that's an option that's worth leaving on. I'm now going to alt click on this edge loop here and again hit S and X to scale this out, again to introduce a bit of volume into here. And I'm just going to jump into the front view and see what this looks like. So S and X, I think I want to pull that in a little bit, and then I want to just select my next edge loop, alt click, and scale that one out a bit more. I'm just trying to get this overall shape. I'm going to select some of these vertices at the top here now, and I'm just going to move them in and down a little bit to help better define this shape. Again, moving around can help with this. What we want to avoid are these flat planes across the top here. So I'm actually going to select a number of these points and I'm going to just go into the side view and bring them down a little bit. It will help to round out the form. We need to do the same at the back here. Can bring them down to a slightly more rounded shape. And we'll do the same along the bottom. We'll select each of these points across the bottom here, just shift select, and then I'm going to nudge them up a little bit. Just under the chin here again. Same thing. That really helps to round out the form. Now noticing here one of these points feels like it's pushed in a little bit too far. Well, this one's not pushed in far enough. So anything like that you see, you can go in and tweak the shape. We're looking around the form to try and create smooth curves to define the shape of this fish. The more you move around in perspective view, the easier it is to see that shape. Look again from the front. I think I can afford to select some of these points, just nudge them in a little bit. That create this shape that we've got here in the concept art. I think what I'm actually going to do is select all of these points down at the bottom here, and again scale them out in X a little bit further. Same with some of these. Give us a bit more volume at the bottom here to better match the concept art. There we are. Just rounding out that nose slightly. I quite like the slightly squared off but soft shape that we've got there. I don't want this to be too square from the front, so bring some of these points in a little bit. There we are. Don't forget to save. Okay, so we're almost ready to start adding in the fins. But before we do that, there are a couple of things that I'd like to address first. First of all, I'd just like to change the order of the modifiers that we've added onto this mesh, and I'll show you why. If we rotate around the mesh, if I select one of these points at the top here, you'll see as I move that in, we're creating a really sharp point at the top here. Now the reason for that is because the order that these modifiers are applied in Blender affects the end result of the mesh. So at the moment, because we're working on half of the mesh, we're actually applying this subdivision modifier to half of the mesh, and then we're mirroring that result over to the other side. If we grab this little icon here and slide our mirror modifier up to the top, what we're now doing is we're mirroring our mesh over to the other side, and then we're applying the subdivision modifier over the top. What that means is if I move this point now, we get a far smoother fall off on the deformation of our mesh. This better approximates the end result that we'll get once we remove the mirror modifier and duplicate our mesh over to the other side. The other thing that I'd like to adjust is the shape of the mesh at the back here where the tail joins. You can see, if we jump into the side view, that we really need a far sharper crease just in here. In order to achieve that, what we need to do is add in an extra edge loop. So if I hit Ctrl R, I can actually then slide this down much closer to that edge loop at the end of the body. You can see by doing that, that gets rid of the stretching at the top and bottom of the mesh. Also, while we were adjusting the points on the top and bottom of the mesh, we didn't adjust the shape of the tail. So I'm going to do that as well now. So I'm just selecting these points at the top here, go into the side view and just pull them down a little bit. We'll do the same at the bottom. And we're going to lift these points up slightly. And while we're about it, we should do the end of the tail and just pull them in a little bit. That will just better round out the form here, give a more natural feel to it. Actually just going to adjust some of these points a little bit here as well. To once again just adjust that shape of that tail slightly so it better matches the concept. There we are. We're now ready to start adding in our fins. If we go into the side view, you can see that because of where we placed this geometry originally, we now have three faces on the top here that we can actually extrude out to create the shape of this fin. So in order to do that, just going to rotate around and select these three faces here. So hitting 3 to enter face select, shift select all of those faces. Now if we were to just extrude these out, the fin would be extremely wide. So what we actually want to do is add in a little bit of extra geometry here through the middle of these faces. But we still want to obviously keep our quad shaped faces while we do so. To help with that, we've got a tool called the Inset tool, which you can activate by hitting the I key on your keyboard. When you do that, as we slide the mouse, you can see it's adding an extra face in the middle of the existing faces. Obviously, we don't want two fins side by side. We want this extra geometry to be added right along that center edge. So what we can actually do with this tool still active is hit the B key, B for boundary. That now means we'll be insetting towards that central boundary. Now just be aware, because of the shape of these faces, if you move this too far, we're actually cutting through the mesh down at the bottom, close to the tail there. So I'm just going to keep this a little bit larger initially, and I'm going to click there so that we're not creating any bad geometry down at the bottom. Having done that, what I can now do is go into vertex select mode. I'm going to select these vertices across the top here, these three. Now we can hit G to grab, but instead of just moving them freely around, if we hit G a second time, that will allow us to slide them along an existing edge. So I can actually slide them closer to the center there. Might just select these two at the top and do the same with them and just slide them a little bit closer still. There we are. What I can also do is slide these a little bit further down, like so. With that done, I'm now going to head back into face selection, select those three central faces, and hit E to extrude them. Just bring them out away to start with. And you can see, because of the angle of the faces, they've actually grown wider as we've extruded them out. So to resolve that, I'm just going to go back into vertex select, hold down Alt and click this one edge, which will select all of those vertices, S to scale and X, and we'll scale them in towards those central points. Having done that, I can hit 3 on the numpad and we can start to shape this fin. So I'm just going to roughly pull these points into place. Not going to get it too tight just yet because we're going to add in a little bit of extra geometry as well to help. So with that done, I'm going to hit Ctrl R to add in an edge loop. Just drop that in the middle, and then again we can start moving these points around to fully define the shape of that fin. So that's looking fairly good. Just going to bring these points down and in a little bit. I'll orbit around and see what we've got. Just going to hit Alt Z, and that turns off X-ray mode, and better see the shape of our fin here. Now there's a little bit of pinching down at the bottom here, so I want to move some of these points around slightly. So I'm just going to hit Alt Z again, so I can see through and see what I'm doing. Just going to tweak those slightly, so we have a slightly smoother fall off at the back here. Yeah. I think that will do us for now. nudge these points back ever so slightly. We've got a little dip in the mesh here that we don't really want. Always trying to keep a nice smooth shape. Now we can just go ahead and repeat the same process for the fin on the bottom. So again, we're going to select these three faces across the bottom here. Go back into X-ray and to my side view here. So again, they nicely match up with the base of our fin. That's why we're very careful to put in those edge loops in the right place in the first place. So once again, we want to inset these faces. So just I to inset. We've still got the boundary mode on. Again, B will toggle that on and off. Click to drop that. And again, we'll go to vertex select. I'm going to select these three vertices, G and G again to slide. And just slide this one in a bit further at the front, with this one too. There we go. Face select, and then we'll extrude these out. Alt click on the edge to select just those vertices and scale them in on X. And then again, we'll jump into our side view to shape the fin. General shape first, which we can then refine further once we've added in the extra edge loop. So Control R to add that loop. What I might actually do, I'm going to undo that and hit Control R. I'm going to add in two loops here, because we ultimately want to be able to deform these fins. Having the extra geometry will be helpful, as well as helping us to better define the shape of the fin just here. So I'm going to pull those vertices in. That's looking fairly good as an overall shape. Don't want us to get too lumpy at the front here, so I'm just going to pull some of these vertices back. Just rotate around to see how that's looking. You can hit Alt Z to toggle the X-ray mode. You can see this is slightly pinched here, so I just want to adjust this a little bit. So let's just grab this point, move it out a little, just try and get a smoother fall off at the front of that fin. That helps a little bit. And then what we'll also do is add in an extra edge loop up at the top there, on that top fin. So, again, Control R, just going to drop that around there. Then I'm going to Alt click on the edge above, hit G and G again, and that will let me slide that edge loop up a little bit. And now we can, again, better define the shape just by moving these vertices around a bit. That will give us an extra bit of geometry in here, which will really help with that deformation when we actually want to animate the fish later on. I'm just spacing these vertices out a bit more evenly. Orbit around. that's okay. Just feeling these points are a little bit high. Just going to tweak them down slightly. Might actually do is just bring them down the back a little bit here, so we're getting a smoother flow to the edge here. Slightly better define that shape. Probably do the same at the bottom here as well. Just nudge these back around a little bit, bring this down towards the back slightly more too. Okay. And that should do us there. The next thing that I'd like to do is start to define the mouth of our character. First of all, what I'm going to do is slightly adjust these points around the mouth to better even them out, because we're actually going to add some extra geometry in here. So I'm just tweaking these down a little bit to give us a little bit of space in here. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is actually select all of these faces around the front here. Selecting right round to the front of the nose there. And then we're going to inset these. So again, we're going to hit I to inset. And again, just double check that you've got boundary mode on, because we want this to go right through to the other side. So now I'm going to pull this in quite a bit. Just click to create the geometry there. I'm going to move some of these points around, tidy it up a little. So just going to move some of these points around a little bit. And I'm just trying to create the basic shape of this mouth here. I want to keep this fairly even. And you can see here we're creating a little bit of a lip in here, which is good. I'm just going to pull these points to the front just back a little bit to better define that chin shape. Just going to nudge these down a little bit as well. Get a better shape to the front just there. Now with that main mouth shape defined, what we can do is again go back into our face select, and we're going to select these faces one more time, and we're going to inset them even further. So again, hit I to inset, move that down, and we actually want to push these into the mesh a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just hit S to scale, and scale them in a little bit. We can again go in and tweak this further. So we can either use vertex select, or we can actually go in and select individual edges here as well and move those around. Reduce. Just trying to get a little bit of a recess in here. Bring edges in, pushing them up slightly as well. And if I just turn off our X-ray mode, you can see we've got this nice crease shape here now defining our mouth. Now, it's a little bit pinched around here. I'd like a little bit more of a cheek shape around here, so we can try and pull some of these points around again a little bit. So I might actually take this and lift it up and push it out a bit more. Maybe take these points here. Let's just X-ray mode back on and just pull them in a little bit further as well. It's always a bit of just moving around the mesh, having a look at it from all angles, turning that X-ray off again, just see if it's giving us the shape that we like. So I think overall that's working fairly well. I might actually take a couple of these points here and move them out a little bit. Just fatten up that lip slightly. Maybe nudge these out and down to round out the top of that nose. I'm going to bring these points on the chin in a little bit as well, just to get a bit of variety. So it's slightly pulled in underneath the chin here. Okay, I think that will do.